Hello? Anyone hear me? All good? Yeah. Okay. Also like to thank Tim and the team at Martinis for Mancini for having us. It's really lovely space. It's really nice being able to have somewhere so close to the shop and somewhere that supports these sort of events for us. So thank you to him. Tonight, I'm very pleased to be introducing Michael Winkler as part of our Salon series. Michael Winkler is a writer of fiction and non-fiction. His novel Grimmish was shortlisted for the 2022 Miles Franklin Award. Winkler won the Calibre Prize for The Great Red Whale, an essay about Uluru, relationships between First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians, mental illness, and Moby Dick. His journalism, short fiction, reviews, and essays have been widely published and anthologized. Grimmish follows the story of Italian-American boxer and pain carriage Joe Grimm on his 1908 to 1909 tour of Australia. Grimm lost his fights, but amazed crowds with his physical resilience and ability to withstand punishment. One of the pleasures of reading Grimmish is the shifting ground Winkler presents. Travelogue, researched history, memoir, meta-essay, and surreal fiction. It's unlike many contemporary books you're likely to read this year. And throughout all of this searching, there are explorations of endurance of pain, consumption of violence, problem of history, and Australian masculinity, to name a few. Finally, the writing is excellent, vivid and self-aware, constantly pulling itself apart in search of the correct term or interpretation that works. It's one of my favourite books I've read this year and in recent memory. Michael, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
I think I can go home now. I think you're supposed to clap at the end. We've given you nothing so far.
Hey, but before we start talking about Grimmish, we always start with a question, and it's one we always ask each other at the shop, and sort of tradition as part of the Salon series, and it's, what have you been reading lately?
Yes, it was the only question you told me to prepare and I forgot to do so. What have I been reading? I would like to recommend Train Lord. And I'd like to recommend it for a couple of reasons. One, because I think it's a really interesting book. It is what it is. There's a pain link there. It came out of Oliver Mole's experience with 10 months of migraine. And I'd like to mention it also because it was given a pretty unconscionable review in a newspaper to which I don't subscribe. So I think it needs some support. It was given a much warmer hearing by BJ Silcox in The Guardian, and I think anyone who follows her recommendations can't go far wrong. So I've been reading that. I read Nimblefoot by Robert Drew, which is a really interesting book. I've just read The Settlement by Jock Sarong. Those two books have some connections. And I will say, and I won't just say it because she's here, but I was telling someone today there's books that you like and books that you love, and there's Smokehouse came out last year by Melissa Manning, and I've told a couple of people that I met her on the weekend, and they were so excited because they just love that book. So if you're looking for a book that you're going to love, Smokehouse, and Melissa might sign it for you. So.
Yeah, a few to note down. Yeah. I remember I read your review of the Robert Drew. I thought it was great. Interesting sort of look at late style, you were saying.
Yeah, whether that's fair or not, but he's about to turn 80, and along with a very interesting group of Australian writers who are all 79 or 80, and I was interested in thinking about what happens to writers at that point in their career, and for him it's brought this new intensity. It's it's a headlong sort of a book that largely I think succeeds.
Oh, future job down. We should get into Grimmish. It's what we're all here for. And I thought I'd start with a sort of general question. I mean, Grimm is such a fascinating character. I mean, someone who sort of a boxer as much as a performer, you know, someone who's sort of cottoned on to this unique, very strange ability to last longer than most people, take an enormous amount of punishment. When did you first hear about Grimm, and what about him interested you?
I heard about him when I was a kid. I read something about him somewhere, and it lodged in my mind this idea of someone who was seemingly impervious to pain. But in the whole history of boxing, which is a very well documented history, he's an outlier. There's never been another boxer who could sustain physical abuse in the way that he could, and so I'd always thought to revisit him, and I thought there was a non-fiction project in it, and I was particularly interested when I realised that he'd come to Australia in 1908-09, and then when I looked around I discovered there simply isn't enough in the records. There wasn't enough to sustain a non-fiction project, and simultaneously I'd been thinking about pain as a theme, and doing a lot of reading and thinking around pain, and it seemed obvious to marry those two projects together.
I was going to ask you about that. I was curious as to how the book started, whether it did start with the intention of writing a purely non-fiction, and at one point it sort of blended into something more, because it really is a hybrid. I mean, the blurb describes it as exploded non-fiction, but even that feels very hard it's a very hard book to pin down. At the shop I'm sort of thinking it's fiction, a novel sometimes, memoir, like in my introduction, so many different things at once. So at one point did those things sort of trickle in? Was it just the limits of research?
It was the limits of research, yes, absolutely. So marrying those two things, and then I had an interest. I wanted to do something. I wanted to do something new. I wanted to try to find a new way to present information, to connect with readers, and to put across the things that I was interested in exploring. And so in order to do that, I had to... I mean, all I've really invented is... I haven't invented it, but all I've done is that I have tried to use the non-fiction as non-fiction. And then I've tried to fill in the gaps with fiction, and then I've tried to show the reader why I made those fictional choices based on memoir or on things that I've read or thought about. So by trying to braid together those aspects, that's why I called it the exploded non-fiction novel, because it seemed to be more akin to how brains work, or my brain works. You know, it's not linear. It's not. It doesn't start in one place and take you to another in a logical progression. It's trying to move around this set of ideas, and these little sort of shoots going off, explaining where the ideas came from, and then trying to have a bit of fun along the way, so it's not just utterly grueling for the reader. Yeah.
Well, at one point, yeah, you have these great... I think one of my favourite... I mean, there are lots of things about the book I loved, but one thing that I did love was the use of this uncle character almost as a tool, in a way, for presenting that blueprint that you're describing of mixing, sort of braiding together elements. The uncle figure is a way to sort of show research without having to lurch into maybe something more academic, or maybe something that you're worried about, I'm not sure, but something drier potentially. He injects a lot of humour into the piece while keeping that research going, keeping things clicking over.
Yeah, you've identified exactly what's happening there. The uncle is a mechanism for that. There's one point, and it seemed a bit maybe obvious to me when I wrote it, but funnily enough, people have said to me, "Oh, I think you've made a mistake there," where I deliberately bleed the narrator, who is and isn't me, with the uncle to show, obviously it's all coming from the same place. And the uncle, who is the uncle of the narrator, who isn't me, is an impossible figure because he must be 150 years old or something, 170 years old. He lives in this vast archive of paper. So he's slowly dying underneath the weight of books and newspapers and journals and documents,
And drinks an enormous amount of sherry, sort of so much that it's sort of astounding that he's even still talking.
And not just any sherry, but Royal Reserve, the finest of all sherries. Yeah.
I want to, you spoke earlier about how, the story of Grimm mixed with this sort of interest you had in pain. And one thing I found fascinating in the book is a certain section where the uncle is describing to the narrator, trying to get them to imagine the feeling of being hit with a baseball bat, swung with a baseball bat at full force at their exposed ribs, to get some sort of indication of the pain that Joe Grimm would have went through. I'm just wondering, how difficult is it to articulate that sort of pain, to adequately describe that pain in writing, in words?
Yeah, that's right. It's enormously difficult, and the literature of pain is not that extensive or that successful. So Virginia Woolf said, the English language, which can give you the inner thoughts of Hamlet or Lear, can't explain what it feels like to have a shiver or a headache. There is something inarticulate about pain, and we know that ourselves, that if we suddenly suffer immediate and extreme pain, we're not phrasing things, we go back to making noises. There's no words there that we can use. I have, I've sat next to someone in intense pain. I think, for example, of my partner giving birth, and I'm sitting right there, and I can understand the pain that she is experiencing, but I can't reach it. You can see the effects of the pain, but there seems to be a limit to that, or at least for me, to that empathy, where you actually can't completely access the pain experience of someone else. So I think that words fall down around pain, and so yes, that at that moment in the book, he suggests in a somewhat sort of irritated way that maybe you should just throw the book away and go and get hit with a baseball bat instead, if you're so interested, yeah.
But it is a difficulty, right? And in the book you do sort of go into this problem of, is all pain the same? Can, even if you are hit in the ribs or something, or even if you're punched in exactly the same way that Joe Grimm was punched, do you register it in the same way? I think that's one of the many, perhaps, difficult things to know about Joe Grimm. And I think you go into that in the book. If he did have dulled senses, potentially, which may also, I think, be quite an offensive thing to assume, which you speak about.
Yeah, the book thinks about that quite a lot because people at the time thought about it quite a lot. So he was examined by prominent surgeons and also phrenologists who couldn't come to it, or they came to conclusions that we think are probably wrong. People would speculate that there was some sort of slowness between his brain and his nervous system. Other people have said the book also ponders whether it could have been like a transcendent or religious experience for him, or the book ultimately concludes that probably he just felt the pain anyway and went on with it, but we can't know. Yeah,
alongside pain, I think I spoke to you, I was trying to talked to you about this before we started, and I do have like a very long, sort of convoluted description of this that I won't go into. I'll try to like avoid reading out that big like paragraph that I wrote. But alongside the depiction of pain, the depiction of boxing within the book and pain experience through that, the book also looks at an enormous amount of different forms of violence. Some, quite shocking. There's a particularly shocking chapter that I think at the end, or maybe just after you say, I hope some people are still with this book after this, where there's a headbutting contest in a pub, something that I believe did happen, or accident did perhaps happen. Well, we'll get to that maybe. But, that animal cruelty, what else? There's eye gouging contests. Anyway, all of these depictions of violence. Why is it important, I guess my question was, to position Grimm's pain, Grimm's boxing, the violence of boxing within a greater culture and context of violence? Why include all of this other stuff?
Well, I think Grimm was part of the Carnival, it was a show. He was the show. People would come along to see if he could be knocked out, not if he could win or not, but it was a freak show, and we could walk out here right now and walk about a kilometre, I suppose, to the less, to where the octagonal building used to be on Victoria Parade, and people flooded in there in 1908 to watch him in a bout that ultimately ended only when a police officer entered the ring to say that it had to stop, that there was murder taking place effectively. Contextualising it with those other things, I think that is part of saying that it's been part of the culture, but also perhaps part of masculine identity for a long time. So the headbutting contest, I have no proof of, but Melville writes about something like that happening. There are some reports of enslaved people in the US being forced to participate in these contests. But also, it's not a million miles removed from the sort of thing that could have and probably did happen in the towns that I grew up in. And that's only, a few decades ago. At Grimm's time, there was bear baiting and there was all sorts of things. You come forward now and there's cage fighting, and I'm agnostic about boxing nowadays. I don't follow it. I don't have a problem with people who want to participate if that's what they want to do. But there's still a big appetite for combat sports and for that sort of spectacle, but it's more... we draw the line in a different place nowadays as to what is acceptable.
Yeah. I guess sponsorship and a lot of things like that make a lot of things acceptable. Yeah, I'm always remember there's a great film Foxcatcher about the Olympic wrestler, and it sort of paints that sort of cage fighting mixed martial arts in a very poor light. It's sort of at the very end the character who's been ruined by these people and can no longer do this noble art of wrestling, Olympic wrestling, sort of sullenly walks through this mass of screaming people into this cage to fight somebody.
Yes, I watched that movie in a hotel room in Auckland. I'm trying to think. There's a murder. It's based on truth, isn't it? Yeah.
But I went off. Sorry, people. I got excited about this. I feel like when we're talking about Grimm, we often talk about him losing, but it's a very difficult thing. I mean, technically, yes, he loses the fights, but at the end of, I remember the first fight you described, I think, with Joe Williams, is that correct?
It's not, but
okay, sorry.
But I can't remember.
But he, the character, the uncle character goes into the change rooms, and the fighter who has technically won can't get his gloves off because his hands are so swollen from punching Grimm. Meanwhile, he goes into Grimm's change room, and Grimm is collecting on side bets that he couldn't get knocked out, and gets his fee for the night. So
that's right, and that was the contest within the contest. That there was no interest in seeing if he won the fight because he wouldn't win the fight. But in 1903, and this will only be of interest to the boxing aficionados, in the space of 6 weeks, he fought the former world heavyweight champion, he fought the reigning world heavyweight champion, he fought the reigning world welterweight champion and the reigning world lightweight champion. And no one else has ever done that, and no one else ever will do that. So in 6 weeks, he fought those 4 people, and none of them could knock him out. And certainly in the fight with Joe Gans, who was the world lightweight champion at the time, the bet was pivoted on whether it could last 6 rounds. So as soon as the 6 round mark was reached, for every successive round, he would earn more and more money. It's inhuman. He's so far out to one edge of the spectrum of what humans can tolerate that it's hard for us to compute. Yeah.
Oh, completely. And I think for those who perhaps aren't familiar with schedules in fighting, I mean, that many fights in 6... I mean, some fighters fight once every 6 months, so to fight 4 in 6 weeks is probably actually illegal.
Now it's illegal. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Let alone fighting people across all these weight classes. Yeah.
Hey, Michael, I believe you're going to do a bit of a short reading for us, if that's okay.
You and I are sitting here with the microphones. I think we should do a bit of Dolly and Kenny or something. You know, we look set up for a Captain and Tennille or something. Yeah, for sure. Yeah? Absolutely.
You want to borrow mine, or you can grab one of those?
Okay.
We'll sell that for a bit more later.
Oh, no, this is going to be a challenge. Guess who didn't bring their reading glasses?
We don't have to.
Do you want some more light?
I would love some more light if that's possible.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sitting on you. Yeah, I see for a reason.
It's going to take a little while. It'll be like 5 minutes. Won't run the battery again.
Let's see if I lose interest in this one.
All right. Until this kind person loses interest. The trick with finding a reading in this book is that there's lots of different bits. But I've gone with a scene where Grimm wakes up in the middle of the desert and is magically transported to a little town in Western Australia, and hears a church bell and decides to go to the church. In the weather-beaten, weatherboard church in Norgunna, the sermon elongates like a wire maker spinning a length of wire, longer and thinner, until it seems impossible that it will keep going, but it does. The sermon stretching beyond clock time and entering calendar time, then geological time, then space-time, then no time at all. Can you tell that I went to church in the country and all through my childhood? The church sweating, the wooden pews opening their pores, squeezing out globules of old wood sweat, stained glass windows swaying in the heat, sagging in the window frames, the timbers of the walls slumping, the sermon rolling on. Grimm can smell the moisture coming through the wool of his suit. The dirt is emptying from under his fingernails, washed out by sweat. His bones have softened, his lungs are water. The only way he can keep alive is to focus very deeply, very sharply on the neck of Mrs. Etteridge in the pew in front. She has inclined her body in the pew in such a way that the fat of her upper back flows over the top of the seat. She is wearing a dress the colour of prunus blossom. Her hat is old and the colour of a blood plum. It has a raggedy tail of lace netting. Grimm guesses that if he sucked it, it would taste of dust and cotton and head sweat. Her hair is matted like the pelt of a baby rabbit. Below the hairline and above her collar is a neck made of horizontally stacked rolls of flesh. When she drops her chin to her chest in prayer and eyes are supposed to be closed, Grimm is intrigued by the horizontal lines that appear as the fat rolls elongate. Sweat is creeping through the fabric of her dress. He pretends to study the front of the hymn book and leans his head far forward until his face is inches from her neck. He feels suspended, doesn't want to move nearer or further away. He breathes in surreptitiously. He closes.
Maybe you need to get higher.
He closes his eyes and leans back in his pew and tries to think other thoughts. The minister's voice is dry as a Methodist wine tasting. Grimm thinks of the last Protestant service he attended, a shipboard burial and the quotidian mundanity of the words uttered, so far from the numinous Latin arcana of his own church. Not unhappy to be here, merely confused, eyes falling in and out of focus, tendrils of sweat hurrying down his calves and the narrow of his back. He runs his hands over his cheeks and wipes them dry on his trousers, her neck, her damp hair. As a teen, touting for shoeshine work in Philadelphia, there were muttered conversations with other bootblacks. The code word they used was polishing, and they explained to him and even demonstrated how it was done, greasy hands pummeling their pale privates for a few quick jerks and then the ludicrous pearlescent squirting. But it wasn't something that he could do, not possible. Instead, he slogged about, supersaturated with turbid obsessions. This girl's fur coat cuffs, that woman's dark and wide eyebrows, the pristine eyes of a dark girl glimpsed outside the market, loose braided hair, a certain timbre, quarter smiles, these like priceless artworks in the gallery of himself that he would peruse again and again every night time, fevered with the impossibility of release, and somehow this made ever speaking to any female he encountered in daylight more impossible. Leaning forward again, swooning towards Mrs. Etheridge, that peculiar nausea, and for a microsecond just, his tongue emerges, quick as a gecko, and he laps the moisture from the back of her neck, a single darting upsweep, and she stiffens, and then her hand comes up to feel the place where his tongue was moments before, but she doesn't turn her head, and Grimm sinks back and screws his eyes tight closed, and no one says a word, and perhaps nothing was noticed or known, and the sermon trudges on. Actually started that section and forgot about the masturbation stuff. So there we are, and it was too late to turn back. So choose a different bit next time.
No, don't worry. I had a similar thing. I went to a friend's birthday on the weekend, and they said, "Read something that you wrote," and I said, "Oh, well, I can't, because the only thing I can think of has this masturbation. It's your birthday, and I can't read in front of it." So I had the same issue. But I think I'll move it along. I don't need to stay on this. I do want to talk about, there's one moment that I think I only caught in my second reading of the book, and I really loved it. There's a moment in the book where Grimm disappears from a scene. It's a scene where Pig Thug, a sort of manifestation of fears and pain and, you know, these sorts of things, rampages through a sort of group of people. And after the sort of mess, Grimm comes back and he's asked, you know, where did you go? And he says, well, that's not my stuff. That's got nothing to do with me. And it struck me as this amazing way to introduce this idea that Grimm is aware that he's in this book. And it does two very strange things in that it sort of gives Grimm agency, but also makes it very clear that he's quite artificial, very much a character made up at the whims of you, at the whims of the narrator, the uncle character almost. I'm just wondering what interested you about having this sort of, these characters that are perhaps aware of the structures that they're in.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say there. The first one is that even though Grimm, the real Joe Grimm, died in the 1930s, and as far as I know, left no family, I'm still aware that I am writing about and upholstering the story of a real person. And, you know, you're taking a hell of a liberty, frankly. I don't want someone to do that to me, and so I wanted to make that clear. It's also clear. Contemporary newspapers reported his speech. He grew up in Italy, and the way that they would write his speech was not the way that I chose to write his speech. So early in the book, I say, look, you know, yes, he does appear to be speaking like an Oxford Don, but that's just how it's going to go from now on. So that was his side of it. My side of it, Pig Thug is interesting. I don't know how clear it is, but the little sort of memoir truth for him is that when I was growing up, when I was in Form 1 we used to call it, there was these two terrifying bullies in Form 4, and Pig Thug is based on one of them. He was someone, his father was a national wood chopping champion, and he was an enormously large person and very sort of pale and pink. And so this was my opportunity, I suppose, to represent the fact that he still has been occupying, you know, a corner of my mind for all those years, you know, since he would grab me by the throat in the school corridor and say, "Sing for me," you know, and so yeah, that's Grim talking to me actually, saying, "Move on, come on."
Well, lots of people talk to the narrator, who I'm guessing is you, but I don't want to conflate. In the book, lots of people talk to you in the book. One thing I did also like in terms of this idea of talking to you, move on, is perhaps a good thing. The characters, the goat, the uncle, they often interrupt. They sort of undercut the authorial voice a lot. For example, I've just got some great quotes here. The goat says, "Enough etching of fucking detail, bit of fucking narrative movement." Or hose down the king shit vocab. It's a technique you sort of also employ in your essay, The Great Red Whale.
Well done.
Thank you.
No one else has picked that.
Oh, I'm glad. You heard it here.
No, that is brilliantly spotted. It was that essay, which was the first sort of successful thing like that I'd done, and the technique that I used was to argue with myself, basically, and to interleave the paragraphs of that essay with my own sort of disgust with myself and the process, and that gave me the way in to do this. So yes, as I say, no one else has spotted that, but that's exactly where that comes from. And I think it's a technique that's really, really flexible and useful, and also could get tiring really quickly. I don't know that I would recommend it to other writers or to other readers, but hopefully one book of it is enough. And it's not a well I would go back to, but you're absolutely right. It allowed me to, you know, we contain multitudes, and yeah, to let those multitudes run around and bicker.
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. I mean, it does so many things at once. It does sort of serve to move the narrative along. Like, you realise that you need to move it along at certain points. Even towards the end of the book, we have what the uncle's saying is so much this is boring. Oh my God, when's this going to... So it sort of serves as this signpost to the next section, but also demonstrates this enormous self-awareness of style, of when to actually begin to finish books, of when to move things on, I think.
Yeah, a little bit like Grim. This book is an outlier, and it's an outlier because it's all me. You know, it didn't have an editor. It didn't even have a proofreader, and that gave me the license to make it exactly what it is. And yeah, I think that.
I'm just wondering, how are we going for time, Anna? I've got some more questions.
It's 6:45.
It's 6:45,
I
okay.
forgot to monitor. 'Cause
No,
I
no,
was
it's
enjoying
okay.
it.
I've got a couple more.
Keep going.
Yeah. One thing, when you were doing your reading, one thing that stood out, and one thing that other people I've spoken to who read the book have mentioned, is this very interesting use of language. I mean, it does have really interesting use of vocabulary, older terms, archaic terms, some scientific terms, for example, ordure, Piger style, sould. I'm just wondering, is it a style that you look to generally sort of include in your writing, or is it specific to Grimmish, this sort of focus on interesting vocabulary?
It's not specific to Grimmish. It's not something you'd use for every project, but I like rich prose. You know, I always say I've done the maths, and if I live to an average age, I've got not even 1,000 books left of me to read, and I want those books to be good books and exciting books, and there's some books written in very straightforward prose that are absolute joys, you know, so it's not a must-have, and there's other books that are dense and experimental and I can't bear them, but as a reader I want to be given a bit more, you know. I want someone to say, look, you've chosen my book out of all the million books in the world, I'm going to give you as much as I possibly can for the time that you're reading it, and I'll throw in some exciting language, and I'll look at this bit, it's all lyrical, look at this bit, it's strangely disjointed, you know. Oh, you appear to be getting bored, here's a joke. You know? Please like me, you know.
I think you've just sold a few copies of the book.
It's a needy technique, you know.
I do want to ask. Some of us who are here will be familiar with the story, perhaps behind. I'm trying to focus on the innards of the book for a lot of this conversation, but the story of its sort of publishing, I think is interesting and worthwhile sort of talking about. It started as a self-published book. It's subsequently been picked up by Puncher and Watman. How does that feel after having gone through that process?
Oh, look, the feelings were all in the year after I finished writing it, and there was an agent who liked it, and he hawked it around to every likely publisher in the country, and no one wanted it. And I thought there was something in it, and some of the rejection letters were encouraging, and others were like, no. What? there was because the agent, and I don't think this is a good thing to do, but he would simply forward me the email, so that the publisher would think that they were writing to him, and he would then flick it straight to me, and it was just, it was tough, you know. I think that you should get more emotionally robust people to be writers, rather than, given that it's a trade that seems to involve a lot of rejection for a lot of years. So that was basically a year-long process. And at the end of that, I thought, I'd self-published a couple of little non-fiction books. I thought, I know how to do it. I will do it. So I did it with a heavy heart. And then it was only sold out of 2 shops initially, and then it started to get people on Twitter talking about it, and social media. It may be a sewer, but it can also be a delight, and thank you to all the people on Twitter. And so it was people in different parts of the world, and I was boasting to Robert that as I caught the tram in here today, I got a little ping, and here's someone in Tel Aviv, and he said, oh, it's taken me a year to get my hands on this book, and then he said really lovely things about it. And the idea that the community of readers, for this sort of book, because it's not a book for everyone, they're not going to sell it in Kmart, but there are readers who are interested in it in different parts of the world. So it got a following on Twitter, different really love. I mean, I'll mention BJ Silcox again. Her support for it was enormous, as you know, Australia's one of the world's great reviewers. Helen Garner said nice things. J.M. Kurtzia read it and said nice things to me, but would only authorise me to to say that it was the strangest book he'd read all year. An academic called Emmett Stinson, who's now based in Hobart and is incredibly linked into contemporary literature around the world. He got behind it, reviewed it for Overland, and I sold out the print run, and then I thought, oh, can I bear to print it again? And Puncher and Watman came into the picture, and they said, oh, you know, we'll take it. So they took the rights, and look, I will say, because it's the reality of being a writer in Australia, it's probably worth saying that the rights to the book and the first 1,000 copies was a glittering 3-figure contract. You know, you would make as much in a day and a half as an electrician, in a day on the mines. And then, about a month later, it was longlisted for the Miles Franklin, and they're so happy, because I'm not sure how many they've sold, but it's certainly been their best-selling book. And then it was shortlisted, and I never really thought it would win. I had a look at who the judges were. I always thought that Jennifer Downs' book would win, and I wanted to win. We all want to win, but given that I wasn't going to win, I was really pleased. I thought it was. I thought that they chose the book that should have won. So yeah, and look, happy days.
Yeah,
and then I get to come and talk to you with all these beautiful people. It's amazing.
I think I was going to say, I mean, the amount of people here, I think, who have read, reviewed and spoken about your book is testament to how good and exciting a book it is to be coming out now. So it's been an absolute pleasure, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. You're a lovely interviewer.
Say a few little